There are some classes everyone wishes would end quickly. Thursday, fourth period at Eisenberg High, a public high school tucked away in Elkhart, Indiana, was one of those classes. Outside, the sky was a dull gray. Differential equations spilled across the whiteboard like ink stains inside the advanced calculus class, threatening to drown the room. The air was thick with the smell of dry erase markers, chalk dust, and old gym shoes. Mr. Callahan, an infamous math teacher known for his monotone lectures and frosty demeanor, was droning on about second derivatives. He wasn't the approachable type. He never smiled. If he did, it was the half-smile kind reserved for catching students off guard or making mistakes. In his classroom, intelligence was the only currency. Empathy had no seat. The students were scattered throughout the room, some leaning on their desks, dozing off, others nodding and feigning attentiveness, while their hands slid under the table to text on their phones. A few eyes stole glances out the window where the pale grey light fell quietly across weathered concrete walls. And then it happened. A sound, small but distinct. Squeak, squeak. The sound of a mop handle brushing across the tiled floor coming from the hallway. Someone turned to look. Not surprised. Everyone knew it was Mr. Ellis, the middle-aged janitor who showed up punctually as the main office's antique clock. He wore the familiar olive-green uniform. Embroidered over his chest were the letters J. Ellis, old shoes, but clean. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if nothing in the world was worth rushing for. Suddenly, "Hey, look, everyone!" Mr. Callahan's voice rang out, laced with a hint of mockery. He turned toward the board, wrote one more line of complex functions, then paused halfway. He turned around and pointed directly down the hallway. "Mr. Ellis, you think you can solve this one?" A chuckle rippled through the room, not loud, but the awkward, reluctant laughter from discomfort. It was a joke, not the first time Callahan had mocked someone to rescue the room from boredom. You always look deep in thought about something big. No one expected Jerome Ellis to respond. He was part of the wall, a background figure present, but invisible. If only he had kept walking. If only he had smiled politely and moved on like always. But this time, he stopped. Jerome straightened up, one hand still gripping the mop. The hallway light slanted across his face, casting shadows over the creases near his eyes. Not angry, not embarrassed. Just a look no one in the class had ever seen before, deep, unwavering calm. He turned and walked into the classroom. No one spoke. No one stopped him. The entire room froze as Jerome propped the mop gently against the wall and slowly made his way to the whiteboard, now buried in equations. Standing before it, he turned to Callahan politely. "Mind if I take a look?" Callahan raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." A few phones quietly slipped out of backpacks. A girl whispered, "Wait, is he serious?" But no one laughed anymore. No one was sure it was still a joke. Jerome picked up the marker. He looked at the problem not like someone seeing it for the first time, but like someone who had memorized every branch, every path in that forest long ago. He didn't rush. He just stood there, eyes narrowing, and then began to write. No flair, no wasted motion, line after line, precise and fluid, as if the numbers had been waiting for him all along, just needing someone to bring them into the light. The air in the room thickened. The class went dead silent. All you could hear was the marker gliding over the board, and the occasional chair creaked as someone leaned forward trying to see better. Callahan stood with his arms crossed. His expression didn't change, but his jaw was clenched. Jerome began to speak in a deep, steady voice, each word crisp. "This looks complicated, but it depends on identifying the inner function. Once you break the sequence apart, everything gets easier to manage. No one interrupted. No one moved. It was as if the entire class had slipped into another dimension where the teacher stood among them, not above them. Quiet, calm, unshakably clear. Finally, he clicked the marker shut, looked at Callahan, then turned back to the students. That's just one way to do it. He didn't bow his head. He didn't wait for applause. He turned back toward the mop. Hand on the handle, he walked away. His footsteps light as if he'd never been there. And then something happened that no one in the room would ever forget. Just as Jerome placed his hand on the mop, a student at the front desk, Ethan Brooks, who never spoke unless it was class-related, suddenly blurted, "Wait, did he do all of that in his head?" No one laughed, no one answered, because all of them were wondering the same thing. After Jerome left, the classroom remained wrapped in a strange kind of silence. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was deeper, more profound. It was as if everyone had just witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Their minds were scrambling to process it. Mr. Callahan stood still at the teacher's desk, his hand loosely gripping the lesson plan, eyes staring into space, as if he was still searching for a flaw in Jerome's written solution. But there was none. No errors, no excess, just an eerie kind of precision. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, students didn't rush out the door as usual. They filed out slowly, as if they were walking out of a dream everyone knew was real, but no one had the words to describe it. At the end of the hallway, Jade Turner, the girl sitting in the third row, hurriedly edited a video clip on her phone. Not to get likes, but because in her mind, one thought rang louder than anything else. People have to see this. In the video, Jerome's hand moved across the whiteboard as if signing memories that had never left him. His voice was low, steady, and clear. You isolate the inner function, then take the derivative piece by piece. At the end of the clip, as he set the marker down and walked away, one student whispered, "He just smoked Mr. Callahan. For real. 3:03 p.m. The video was posted to TikTok with the caption, "Janitor just outdid the calculus teacher." No calculator, no hesitation. Within just 2 class periods, the clip had over 10,000 views, was shared in the school's Facebook group, and was reposted on Instagram stories. Some captions read, "This man needs a chalkboard, not a mop." Others just had a single exclamation emoji. What made it go viral wasn't just the surprise, it was the beauty of how Jerome did it. No showboating, no anger, no humiliation. He walked in, did what he knew, and walked out like it had never happened. In the teacher's lounge, Callahan sat at the desk near the window pretending to grade papers, but never taking his eyes off the laptop in sleep mode. An email had just come through from a parent. The subject line read, "Thought you'd want to see this." Inside there was only a link. No comment. He turned off the screen without clicking, not because he wasn't curious, but because he already knew what was waiting on the other side. The thing he wasn't ready to face. He was an experienced math teacher who had just been publicly upstaged by a man he had never thought about twice. Meanwhile, on the 3rd floor, 10th graders gathered outside the supply room. No one needed a broom or a mop bucket. They were standing there, unsure what else to do, except hope Jerome would open the door and step out. A 7th grader, clutching a geometry workbook, asked timidly as Jerome walked by, "Sir, do you tutor?" Jerome stopped, not out of annoyance but surprise. How long had it been since anyone had asked him that? He gave a slight nod, a smile flickering like rare sunlight on a grey day. "I used to. A long time ago." The boy looked down and said quietly, "I think you should do it again. I think you're excellent." That evening in his small 2nd-floor apartment in an old housing complex, Jerome made himself a cup of hot tea and sat on the balcony listening to the distant sound of passing cars like he always did. But in his mind, the equations from earlier still glowed with perfect clarity. Years had passed, and yet the moment he held a marker, it all came rushing back like his body, though tired from scrubbing floors every day, still remembered every step of the mathematical choreography he used to love. That night, Jerome opened the box under his bed where he kept his old Purdue sweatshirt, his college transcripts, and a photo of him and his mother on his first day at university. He didn't put the sweatshirt on, didn't linger long on the photo. He touched each faded line on the paper as if gently waking a part of himself he had long buried to survive. The next morning, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. When Jerome walked into the main hallway, students began to notice him. Some nodded as he passed something that hadn't happened in 6 years. A girl smiled genuinely and said, "I saw the video." "You're amazing." He returned the gesture with a simple nod, but inside a quiet wave stirred. How long had it been since someone looked at him like that? Not with pity, not with polite detachment, but with real recognition as someone worth listening to. When he turned into the library, once just a room of dusty books and quiet air, Ethan Brooks was already there, along with 2 other students. One of them held up an advanced calculus textbook, a page marked with a neon pink tab. "Mr. Ellis, could you help us with this problem?" Jerome paused this time from emotion. "Don't you have class?" he asked. "We got permission to skip a period," one replied. Mr. Callahan approved it. And so in the hallway beneath a wall plastered with science fair posters, a man in a janitor's uniform sat cross-legged on the floor with 3 students. No podium, no titles, just a pen, a notebook, and something inside him that had been asleep for far too long. The belief that he could still make a difference. And for the first time in years, Jerome Ellis wasn't the man who cleaned the floors. He was the man who made the equations clear. Jerome never planned to revisit the past. Life had taught him that sweet or painful memories were like cracked porcelain. Touch them too much, and they'll shatter. But that night, sitting alone in his tiny kitchen, under a warm yellow light, and the soft ticking of a wall clock, it all came flooding back so vividly he could almost smell the lecture hall again. The rustle of notebook pages, the soft tap of pens against an old wooden desk, and his mother's voice reading him stories at bedtime when he was still the boy who took everything apart to understand how it worked. He had once been an academic star in Gary, Indiana, a tough industrial town where most kids thought about finding jobs before thinking about college. But Jerome was different. He had eyes that saw deeper into numbers and a mind that needed to know how things functioned. There were old bikes from the neighborhood, broken fans, and even the neighbor's washing machine. Jerome was always the one who just knew how to fix it. No one taught him. He learned by touching the world, with both his hands and a curiosity that never slept. His mother, Rosa Ellis, worked the night shift at a textile mill. A petite woman, her eyes were tired but always bright when they looked at her son. She didn't have a high degree. She didn't understand the math formulas Jerome would fill his notebooks with, but she understood the difference. And she believed. Every night before heading to work, she read to her 3 children. Then she would leave a small note next to a cold bowl of Noodle's books first, life later. She believed in education the way others believed in God, not because it was easy, but because it was the only path out of a place without exits. Jerome grew up with that teaching etched into his heart. And he made it. Valedictorian of his high school, state science fair champion, awarded a full scholarship to study mechanical engineering at Purdue University. a milestone no one in his family had ever dared dream of. On his first day of college, he and his mother posed for a photo in front of the campus gates. She wore an old dress carefully ironed with no wrinkles. Jerome wore a crisp white shirt, clutching a brand new backpack. Now resting inside the old box under his bed, that photo proved a time when he truly believed anything was possible. His first year at university was a living dream. He learned quickly, caught the attention of professors, and even began tutoring struggling classmates. His memory was like a tape recorder. Once a formula passed through, it stayed. He started sketching early designs of engine models and gear mechanisms and dreamt of bridges that would one day bear his name at their foundations. But then, a phone call from home changed everything. His mother collapsed at the mill. The doctor was blunt, late-stage cancer. Not much time left. Jerome took the night bus back to Gary. In a cold hospital room, she lay there, her eyes half open, her hand gripping his. Her voice was a whisper, like wind. "Don't come back, baby." "I'm fine. Keep studying. Don't stop." But he couldn't. No one else in the family could take charge. His two younger sisters, only 13 and 15, could only cry. His father had long disappeared. Every responsibility now fell on the shoulders of a 19-year-old boy. Jerome decided to take a semester off, then another. At first, it was supposed to be temporary, but life doesn't work on temporary. He worked warehouse shifts, lifting crates all night. By day, he cared for his mother, cooked meals, and managed medications. Tuition went unpaid. Emails from school became fewer. No one called to ask why he hadn't returned. No one asked if he needed help. And when his mother passed away one early winter morning, Jerome stared out the hospital window, emptier than he'd ever been. No home, no school, no dream. He survived on instinct. He took whatever job he could, stocking shelves at grocery stores, doing night security at distribution centers, and cleaning malls. The same mind that once wrote research papers now used itself to memorize shift schedules, door codes, and due dates for utility bills. He thought he'd go back to college. He filled out re-enrollment forms a few times, but something always got in the way, an overdue bill medication for his sister, the last meal of the month. Those forms were never sent. Then a flicker of hope. Harold Bennett, owner of a small flooring company in South Bend, noticed Jerome's speed and sharp measurements while he helped estimate a floor installation. "You've got a mind," Harold said. "Don't waste it. I'll train you. We'll do it right." Jerome agreed. A real job. A small future, but with a foundation. But just one day before his first shift, his youngest sister, Tiana, was caught in a fight at school. A stupid clash sparked by racial slurs. She was threatened with expulsion. No one showed up for the disciplinary meeting. Jerome skipped his first day on the job to be there for her. Harold filled the spot with someone else. The door that had just cracked open, quietly shut for good. From that day on, Jerome stopped dreaming. He started choosing the easiest thing: stability. A job that wouldn't change, a place where no one judged, no hope, but no heartbreak either. And then he came to Eisenberg High, applied for a janitorial position, said nothing about his past, didn't mention college. I didn't tell anyone he'd once been at the top of his mechanical engineering class. Just glass panels to wipe each day, hallways to sweep, and the math problems he occasionally saw on the whiteboards were still as familiar as old friends who never truly left. 3 days after the calculus incident, Jerome was changing a trash bag in the library when Ethan Brooks appeared again, not alone. With him were 2 other students, each carrying notebooks and a well-worn calculus book marked with bright pink sticky notes. Ethan tapped the table, and said as if it were the most natural thing, "Mr. Ellis says, we have a question. Do you have a moment?" Jerome considered declining. Explaining equations wasn't part of his job, but the look in the three students' eyes wasn't admiration. It was the look of kids who genuinely wanted to understand something. He couldn't say no. He sat down on the long bench near the bookshelf. It's not the kind of seat teachers use, just an old wooden bench occasionally used for reading newspapers. The kids laid out their notebooks, flipping to pages underlined and circled in red. And then Jerome began to teach. It's not like Callahan with jargon that's as sharp as razors, but slowly, clearly, and with something deeply human in the way he explained. This is a cubic function, he said, but don't let it confuse you. Think of it like a road, and the derivative. That's the slope of that road. The kids nodded. One suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, so this part is like a curve, right?" Jerome smiled, not broadly, but warmly. "Exactly, and the derivative at the curve tells you how fast the slope changes at that exact moment." And just like that, surrounded by textbooks, the smell of old paper and the soft hum of the library's quiet, a nameless class began to form. No podium, no bell, just pencils, scratch paper, and hearts learning not to fear numbers. The rumor spread faster than any internal email. First it was the juniors, then the sophomores. Even the kids who struggled with math started drifting closer. Jerome never turned anyone away. Whenever someone said, "Mr. Ellis, I'm stuck on this," he sat beside them. Never raised his voice, never got frustrated. One day, a ninth-grade girl, Nia Thomas, walked in carrying a notebook scribbled all over her eyes, brimming with tears from a recent failed math test. She blurted out, "I hate math. It makes me feel stupid." Jerome looked her straight in the eyes, speaking in a calm tone, as if he were talking to his disappointed daughter. "Math doesn't make anyone feel stupid. What makes people feel stupid is how it's taught." Then he pointed to a mistake in her notebook, not with judgment or disapproval. "You got this part wrong. But that doesn't make you bad. That makes you someone who's learning." From that moment on, Ellis Sessions was born. No one officially named it, but the students began calling it that. Every Tuesday and Thursday after the final school bell, the corner of the library near the window would light up not from the overhead lights, but from the glow in the eyes of children beginning to understand something they once feared. And it wasn't just students who came. Some teachers began to casually pass by the library at the end of the day. They saw Jerome sitting cross-legged on the floor, back against the bookshelf, a mini whiteboard in his hands, patiently explaining to a group of 8 students, like someone who never believed he was worthy of teaching, but was always ready to share what he had. Jerome didn't change the way he walked, didn't change how he dressed, didn't call himself anything other than a janitor. But something inside him was shifting. Like after years of living with a smothered dream, he could now feel it stirring again quietly, like a seed pushing through ashes. And the most beautiful part was, this time he didn't have to do it alone. The first changes came like a breeze, not loud, not obvious, but enough to shift the atmosphere in the school. Students who once walked past Mr. Ellis without lifting their heads now stopped and nodded hello. Some asked, "Do we have Ellis Sessions today?" as if it were an actual class. An 8th grader stuck a note on his locker. "Mr. Ellis knows things. Ask him." A small group even formed an after-school club. The only requirement to join was bringing a math question and curiosity. While students spread their respect through glances and whispered stories, not all the looks were the same in another corner of the school. Some teachers, so used to their fixed roles, began to feel uneasy. Not because Jerome Ellis had done anything wrong, but because he had done something they hadn't considered. He made students believe in themselves, not through grades, not through pressure, but by listening, truly listening. And then the backlash quietly surfaced. An anonymous email was sent to the principal's office. Is it appropriate to have a janitor with no teaching credentials instruct students on school grounds? Has his background been vetted? Are there legal liabilities? Principal Mason, who had reviewed hundreds of job applications over the years, read the email without surprise. He understood that the concern wasn't about safety. It was about the discomfort caused when power lines start to blur. And he knew very clearly the problem wasn't Jerome. The problem was that Jerome was no longer invisible. That afternoon, he called Jerome into his office. The 50-year-old man entered still wearing gloves, damp from rinsing the cafeteria sink. The faint smell of soap clung to his uniform. He removed his cap, a habit of someone who had always known how to be respectful. Mason didn't dance around the issue. I hear you've been helping students after school. I also saw the viral video last week. Jerome nodded slowly. I just help when they ask. I don't mean to disrupt. Mason interrupted not harshly but firmly. You're not disrupting, you're inspiring, and we need that more than ever. He handed Jerome a proposal to make the after-school tutoring sessions official, recognized, scheduled, and compensated. Not to replace your job, Mason explained, but to add another piece to the piece you're already doing so well. Jerome didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, calloused from 15 years of scrubbing floors. He gave a faint smile. I haven't taught in a long time. Mason answered without hesitation, but you never stopped knowing. What seemed like a reward became a source of restless thought all night. Not because of the money, not because of exhaustion, but because Jerome understood too well every step toward the light casts longer shadows behind you. And Jerome had never lived to be seen. He had chosen silence for most of his life, not because he lacked a voice, but because he didn't think anyone truly wanted to hear it. That night, he opened the old box beneath his bed again. Inside, the diploma he never claimed, a photocopy of his college transcript, his faded Purdue sweatshirt. And now, a new stack of thank you letters written in students' sloppy handwriting, but full of sincerity. Because of you, I understood my first lesson ever. You didn't yell when I got it wrong. You asked where I went wrong. You made me believe that math isn't to label who's smart or not, but to understand the world. Jerome quietly placed those letters into a new section of the box. Then he sat alone, a cup of tea cooling on the table, the yellow lamp casting a soft glow on a face lined with years and eyes still lit from within. He didn't know how many would support him tomorrow or how many would oppose him, but he knew one thing: students were waiting for him. Not to hear an answer, but to believe they could find it themselves. On the first day of the unofficial study session, Eisenberg High's library felt noticeably different. The afternoon sunlight poured through the window panes, casting long streaks across the floor and rows of old wooden tables. But the most remarkable difference wasn't the light. It was the faces of students quietly pulling up chairs around a round table in the far corner of the room. A place they had given a simple, heartfelt name, Mr. Ellis's table. Jerome arrived earlier than usual. He brought a brown folder inside that contained printed sheets of math exercises, a few handwritten notes, and a small whiteboard he had borrowed from the old science lab. No one had asked him to do this. No one required him to prepare. But Jerome knew if someone had chosen to believe in him, he had to be ready to be worthy of that belief. Not with a title, but with respect. 10 minutes after the dismissal bell, over 10 students were already there, both the high achievers and the ones who had failed their midterms. Some even brought younger cousins' kids from lower grades because Mr. Ellis explains things well. and Jerome, in his olive-green janitor's uniform, began writing on the board, "This isn't a class. I don't give grades, but you can ask me anything. No need to raise your hand, and no need to be afraid of being wrong." The first thing he did wasn't solve a problem. He asked each student, "What part confuses you the most? Not where did you mess up, not why don't you get it yet, but which part scares you?" For the next 90 minutes, he didn't stand. He sat, eye level with the kids. He scribbled by hand. He explained through everyday things, a bicycle wheel, a traffic light, the curve of a marble rolling down the stairs. Things the students saw every day and then realized math wasn't some distant world. It was right here, in every movement of life. When the session ended, no one wanted to get up. A girl named Tasha, who once cried over her fear of math, whispered, "That's the first time I thought a solution was beautiful." Jerome smiled, his eyes touched with quiet nostalgia. Math has always been beautiful. People just made it scary, but not everyone could see that beauty. In the teacher's lounge, murmurs began to circulate. Some were genuinely impressed, like Ms. Grant, the physics teacher who visited the library to observe the session. Afterward, she walked up to Jerome, gently placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You have a gift, not just with numbers, but with people." But others didn't speak. They just carried a heavy silence, like Mr. Callahan. He didn't forbid anything, didn't openly criticize. However, in staff meetings, whenever someone brought up the positive impact of Mr. Ellis, he would change the subject. Sometimes he'd drop a cold remark, "Let's be careful not to confuse teaching with inspiration. We're educators, not storytellers." It sounded objective, but everyone understood it was the quiet resistance of a man whom Jerome had publicly silenced. Principal Mason didn't let it fester. One morning, he called Callahan into his office and got straight to the point. "I know that day was difficult for you, but Jerome didn't do that to belittle anyone. He made students want to learn, and that's something no curriculum can teach." Callahan didn't argue. He sat in silence, hands folded. That silence was no longer pride. It was confusion, because deep down he knew Mason was right. What bothered him wasn't that Jerome had taught correctly. It was that he, a trained educator, had not been able to make his students feel heard, like a janitor with no teaching credentials. Meanwhile, Jerome kept to his routine, starting at 6 a.m., mopping hallways, checking faucets, tidying classrooms after each period. But now inside his shoulder bag, next to his spray bottle and rag, there was also a stack of printed math problems. During breaks, he sat in the cafeteria corner, scribbling extra notes, thinking of simpler ways to explain things. He didn't need a wall of honors. He didn't need anyone to call him teacher. All it took was one student sitting down, sighing, and saying, "I still don't get this part." And he'd know he needed to be there. Within 3 weeks, Ellis Sessions, a casual gathering of a few curious students, became a phenomenon. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the far corner of the library where Jerome usually sat no longer had enough chairs. Students brought pillows, sat on the floor, stacked book crates to make seats. Some arrived 30 minutes early to sit closer to Mr. Ellis. The way these kids showed up was not for grades, not for prizes, but to understand, to learn. This made the entire school reevaluate itself. Ms. Grant, the physics teacher, was the first to ask for a copy of Jerome's teaching notes to use in her review lessons. "The way you explain derivatives by comparing them to accelerating on a bike, my students remembered it instantly," she said, laughing and shaking her head. Coach Daniels, the athletics coach, was stunned to find his basketball players, who usually skipped practice, now voluntarily asking to miss a session to study with Mr. Ellis. One day Daniels peeked into the library and saw his towering center hunched over graphing a function. When he stepped back into the hallway, he muttered in awe, "This man just did what a year of coaching couldn't. He made the kids want to try." Even the veteran teachers who had always kept a distance from Jerome began showing up. At first, they sat quietly in the back, pretending to sort paperwork. But soon they started truly listening. One older teacher, who had never spoken more than 3 sentences to Jerome in the teacher's lounge, lingered after a session and asked quietly, "Would you mind if I learned from how you explain things?" Jerome smiled without a trace of pride. "I'm still learning myself, but if I can share anything, I'd be happy to." While most teachers started acknowledging Jerome's influence, Mr. Callahan remained the most significant question mark. He didn't speak ill, he didn't interfere, but not once had he stepped into the library since that day. In his classroom, he continued teaching with precision, methodically, thoroughly, but the students noticed he no longer called on people without warning. He no longer mocked mistakes. Instead, he began leaving more pauses between his questions, as if something within him was quietly reflecting, subtle, reserved, but real. Then one Thursday afternoon, something no one expected happened. That day's Ellis session was more crowded than usual. Not just with students, but also with a few parents who had wandered past the library and decided to step in to see the janitor who teaches math without chalk. At that moment, Jerome explained integrals, comparing them to counting each step on a mountain hike. When Callahan walked in, no one said a word. Some students glanced up, cautious, but Callahan showed none of his usual demeanor. He stood at the back of the room, hands in his pockets, quietly observing. No clipboard, no notes, just silence. But this time, it was the silence of someone listening. Just as Jerome wrapped up that segment 15 minutes later, Callahan stepped forward. His voice was softer than usual, but still carried his sense of dignity. "Would you mind if I stayed a bit longer?" Jerome was slightly surprised. But only for a moment. He smiled, nodded, and said, "As long as you don't mind learning something new." The room let out a gentle laugh, not mocking, but because they all felt something real was happening. A chair was pulled out. Callahan sat on the other side of a classroom for the first time. Jerome continued as if nothing had changed. But their eyes met for a brief, meaningful moment. There was no above or beneath anymore, only people who wanted to understand and to be understood. From that day on, Callahan didn't say much about Jerome, but he began leaving complex math problems on students' desks with small notes. "If this doesn't make sense, ask Mr. Ellis. He'll know how to help." For Jerome, there was nothing more to say. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need excuses. That nod and the empty chair pulled out that day. It was a more beautiful reconciliation than any words could offer. At Eisenberg High, something was truly changing, not because of a reform program, not because of technology, but because one humble man sat down, listened, and reminded everyone. Learning is a journey, not a competition, and anyone can begin again. With a wooden chair, a pen, and a question that seems naive, "I don't get this part. Can you help me?" A month after the afternoon when Callahan stayed for an Ellis session, the library at Eisenberg High was no longer just a space for books. It had become a place of transformation, where students who once failed exams now eagerly solve quadratic equations. Kids who used to hide their notebooks in shame now raised their hands with shining eyes. Sticky notes in all colors covered the bulletin board in the back, filled with rushed handwriting but heartfelt messages. "Thanks, Mr. Ellis. I don't hate math anymore. Because of you, I stopped thinking I was dumb. You helped me find my voice." While the students called it magic principle, Mason saw something even more powerful, a real opportunity. One Monday morning, he called Jerome into his office. This time, not to handle complaints, but to present a proposal that had already received preliminary approval from the school board. "We want to make your sessions official," Mason said, placing a light blue folder on the table. "An elective course, no grades. Not mandatory, but it will appear on the schedule. A class about math, logical thinking and confidence. The course will be called Ellis Sessions." Jerome looked down at the folder. Inside was a syllabus, a proposed schedule room assignments, a modest budget for materials, and his name is printed in bold at the top. He was speechless. No one had ever printed Jerome's name on an academic document except for his freshman transcript, where he once ranked at the top. And now, after all those years of working, everyone was treated as invisible, and his name appeared in the official high school curriculum. But that emotion didn't come with an easy nod. "I don't know," Jerome said slowly. "I never thought I'd stand in front of a class again. I never even thought I'd stand in front of anyone. After my mother passed, I don't want to be seen as someone trying to overstep." Mason didn't interrupt. He understood. He'd been expecting that response. "I don't think you're overstepping. I think you're stepping into the right place, the role of someone who inspires, who teaches through trust, not chalk or titles." Jerome asked for a few days to think. That night he returned to his small room and opened the old box like always. But this time he brought a new light wooden box he'd bought from a small craft store near the bus stop. He carefully removed each item from the old box and wiped off the dust, his Purdue sweatshirt, a photo with his mother, his old grade report, and now a stack of envelopes filled with handwritten letters from students. He arranged them all in the new box neatly and gently, then placed them on the highest shelf in the room. Not under the bed anymore, no longer hidden, because he knew he wasn't running from that old dream anymore. He was living it again in a very different way. The next day, he met with Principal Mason. "Thank you for believing in me," Jerome said, his voice as calm as the man himself. "But I don't need a class with my name on it. I don't need an official course. I need an empty chair. And a student brave enough to ask. Let them come because they want to, not because they have to." Mason didn't try to persuade him further. He nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then we'll support you your way." From that point on, there was no official class named after Jerome. No internal announcements, no nameplates on the door. But what happened every Tuesday and Thursday continued growing, deepening, and most importantly, voluntarily. A local newspaper caught wind of the story through students and parents. A reporter came to ask for an interview. Jerome only said, "I don't have a special story. I do what any of us can do, listen to someone when they feel invisible." When the article was published, a small headline beneath Jerome's photo read, "From janitor to mentor, but he was always a teacher." The whole town read it. Some even cried, but for Jerome what mattered most was still the same. The moment a student walked into the library, opened a book and whispered to their friend, "This part's tough. Mr. Ellis will know what to do." Time passed without warning. Winter came and went, leaving behind pale white salt streaks on the hallways, streaks that Jerome Ellis still cleaned every morning, with steady hands. But in that quiet routine, something was slowly growing. A small community of young people who believed they weren't stupid, just never explained things the right way. Ellis Sessions was no longer just a study circle around a mini whiteboard. It became a quiet network, where the students Jerome once helped were now helping each other. Some Saturdays, Tasha, the girl who once cried from fear of math, would invite her cousins over and hold a mini-session using Jerome's notes. She printed derivative charts into colorful flashcards, writing on the back, "You don't have to be good right away. You have to dare to try again. One day, Jerome happened to overhear Tasha teaching her younger cousin repeating his exact analogy. Remember what Mr. Ellis said? A derivative is like measuring the slope of a hill. Every point feels different. Jerome stood outside the doorway. He didn't step in. He just smiled quietly, one hand resting on the doorframe. In that moment, no applause, no spotlight, but he knew what he had planted was taking root. Even the teachers who had once doubted him began moving from silent observers to active participants. Ms. Grant asked Jerome if she could use one of his explanations during a test review session. Coach Daniels asked him to write a basic guide so the coaches could teach the players analytical skills. Jerome didn't refuse. He never refused anyone who genuinely wanted to learn. And then Callahan began showing up more frequently, not to supervise, but to learn. Once he stood at the back of the room, watching Jerome teach intently. After class, he walked over and said, "I used to think teaching was about power. Turns out, it's about presence." Jerome didn't respond right away. He said, "I used to think I had nothing left to teach. But maybe, just being there at the right time is teaching already." Not long after, Ethan Brooks, the first student who had ever asked Jerome to solve a math problem that day, placed a thick folder on his desk, clipped with a handwritten letter. Inside it read, "I compiled your sessions, Mr. Ellis. I called it the Ellis Handbook, not to replace you, but so that one day those who never got to meet you could still hear your voice through the way you teach." Jerome read every line, every formula, and every example rewritten by the students. There were mistakes, but he didn't correct them. Because what mattered wasn't the outcome. It was the journey of understanding. 1 week before the graduation ceremony, the library was modestly decorated for the year-end event Student Showcase Day, where students displayed their work projects and accomplishments. In a small corner by the window stood a round table. No models, no computers, just handwritten notes, a few photos from the sessions, and a paper sign taped above Mr. Ellis's table, where those who once feared math learned to believe in themselves. Throughout the afternoon, dozens of students came by not to see, but to say thank you. Some hugged him, some wrote down the phrase he had gently repeated so many times. "Wrong doesn't mean failure. Wrong means you're trying." One parent who had once anonymously emailed a complaint about him approached. She didn't say much, just extended her hand. The doubt in her eyes had been replaced with something resembling gratitude. As night fell, everyone packed up to leave. Jerome stayed behind. He stood by the display table, reading the colored ink messages, scribbled by students, tilted uneven messy, but full of heart. He didn't need to take a photo. Those words were already etched in his memory deeper than any award could ever go. Back home, Jerome opened the wooden box on his shelf. He took out his old Purdue sweatshirt and laid it on the table for the first time. Not to wear, but to fold. Carefully, deliberately, next to the sweatshirt, he placed a new stack of letters, thank you notes, written by hand with a heart, with the journey those students had walked with him. There was no golden plaque bearing his name, no grand ceremony with triumphant music. But Jerome knew more than anyone, a teacher doesn't need a podium to leave a mark. Just someone who stepped out of the shadows because his presence lit them. On the final afternoon of the school year, Eisenberg High was more lively than usual. Students wheeled suitcases, waved goodbye, teachers snapped pictures, and laughter echoed to the back fence of the football field. Amid the end-of-year chaos, Jerome Ellis, as always, quietly wiped the stair railings, replaced the restroom paper, and checked the lights in the science wing. But if you looked closely, you'd notice he moved a little slower today. Not because he was tired, but because he wanted to stay with every corner, just a little longer. As if this place wasn't just where he worked, but where he'd been given back the dream he thought he had lost. On the old wooden table in the library, the familiar corner of the Ellis sessions, the mini whiteboard was still there, along with student notes and a line of chalk-written text someone had carefully penned that morning. "Thank you for showing up, Mr. Ellis." Jerome sat down. His hand rested on the worn edge of the table. The space around him was quiet but not lonely. In his heart, the faces of students appeared one by one like a film reel. Ethan Brooks had a shy look when he first asked for help. Tasha beaming the day she finally grasped derivatives. Nia, the girl who once hated math, is now teaching her younger sibling at home. None of them ever knew Jerome once believed he'd never stand before anyone again and say something that mattered. He thought of his mother, Rosa, the petite woman who used to sit beside his bed reading stories at night, even after exhausting graveyard shifts. Her voice echoed from those distant years. "The world will try to close its doors on you, son. But if you carry the key, no one can stop you from stepping through." Jerome had lost that key for many years, but what he didn't expect was, while scrubbing floors, fixing leaky pipes and wiping down whiteboards after class, it was the quiet belief of others that gently placed the key back into his hand piece by piece, not through a hall of fame, not with a prestigious diploma, but through every student's expectant eyes each afternoon. Everyone whispered, "Mr. Ellis, can you help me with this?" And with the phrase he repeated countless times, not to explain math, but to restore faith. "It's normal not to understand. Don't be afraid." As the sun dipped behind the classroom building, Jerome stood up. He gathered the scraps of paper, stacked each chair, and wiped the mini board clean. Not out of duty, but as a final ritual of a lesson he never officially taught, yet passed on something greater than knowledge. Before he left, he placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to whoever might find it someday. "I wasn't a certified teacher, but I taught. I didn't have a podium, but I was heard. I left behind no sample exams, but I left behind trust. And if you're holding this letter, remember this. You don't need someone to tell you you're special. You need someone willing to stop and truly see you. Because sometimes the most outstanding teacher isn't the smartest one, but the one who shows up at the right moment." Jerome Ellis. As he walked out of Eisenberg High that afternoon, there were no fireworks, no music, only soft sunlight on his shoulders and the distant hum of summer traffic approaching. But within every child who once sat at Mr. Ellis's table, within every teacher who had quietly listened, within every gaze that had been transformed, he was still there, not through accolades, not through recognition, but through a space in each heart, where only the truest teachers leave a mark, even if they never stood on a stage. Legacy isn't written on achievement boards. Legacy lives in the hearts that dared to dream again because someone quietly lit the lamp. Look around you. That person who helped you through a moment you almost gave up on might have been someone ordinary, uncelebrated, unseen, but who was there right when you needed them most.